What is up, Bat Family? Welcome to Batman Theory, where we take a deep dive into comic books, movies, cartoons, and everything in between that has to do with The Dark Knight. So guys, before we get started, I'd like to invite you all to Batman Trivia every Monday and Wednesday nights at 9:30 Eastern Time, and you can join us there. Winner gets a really cool Batman t-shirt. Come test your trivia knowledge against other Batman fans, and it's a really good time. So I'd ask you guys to stop by. I really think you'd enjoy it.
And here we go.
So on today's episode of Batman Theory, I have a really interesting thing I want to bring up. I want to have a whole new section here, a whole new playlist where we talk about what if Batman was in the Marvel Universe. And I know it's something that we Batman fans have often thought about, and I want to kind of really go in depth on each individual thing. What would his villains be like? What would each villain be like? What would Batman be like? Where would he fight crime? Everything really changes once you get into the Marvel Universe versus DC. So naturally I want to start at the most obvious point. Where would Batman fight crime? What city would he fight crime in? And Marvel and DC have very different types of cities. So DC, for the most part, does fictitious cities. You got Star City, you got Gotham City, you got Metropolis, Bloodhaven. So you have those versus you have Marvel, which almost entirely, not all the time, they do fictitious locations as well, but a lot of the primary cities are real cities. Specifically, New York City is one of the most commonly used ones in Marvel. And New York City and Gotham are very similar in a lot of ways. I know Gotham was, in a lot of ways, based off of parts of New York City. So I think it's safe to say Batman would fight crime in New York City if it was in the Marvel Universe. However, I don't want to talk about New York City of today. I don't want to talk about, New York City of any specific time except for the 1970s. So why do I say I think Batman would fight crime in the 1970s New York? Well, 1970s New York is a very different time. If you type in what was New York City like in Google, the 70s is by far the first thing that pops up. And one of the reasons is New York City in the 70s was very dirty, very crime-ridden, very corrupt, and it was just a lot of pollution. There was a lot of bad things, a lot of bad people in New York City in the 70s. And I think if this was to carry over into the Marvel Universe, I really think it would be a perfect spot, really a big breeding ground, a petri dish, if you will, for Batman's villains. And I think it really brings on the necessity of a superhero like Batman. Sure, you have your Spider-Mans, you have the anti-heroes like Punisher, you have all those heroes that really populate New York City already for Marvel. However, I think Batman is an entirely different type of superhero, and obviously he is 100% based on fear. And I think his entire tactics and everything, I think a lot of it will change if he went over to the Marvel Universe, but for right now, let's just say a lot of it stays the same, and for the sake of it, I really think New York City would be the perfect breeding ground. So one of the reasons the 70s in particular were so bad in New York City is because in the real world, New York City had a $10 billion budget deficit in the 1970s, and the mayor was forced to cut police force workers. A lot of them, he cut a lot of the workers in the fire department, sanitation. So crime, robberies, everything was just running amok. It went way up. Murders happened a lot more frequently. New York was really not a safe place in the 70s, and it kind of kept that bad rap all through the 80s as well, and really bled into the 90s. And even though it was much safer up into to that point. And with the budget deficits affecting the police force, I think corruption would be even worse, because I think people, rather than having your Carmine Falcones and those ones that will, start paying off the police force, I think you'd have guys like the Kingpin who would just really pay off the police force, and you would have even more corruption than you'd even see in Gotham. And I think 1970s New York City would be literally the perfect. I couldn't even think of a more perfect city or time era of when Batman could get started and really make a big difference right away. So that's all for today, guys. So next video we're going to be covering in this playlist, we're going to be covering what would Batman look like. What would his powers be, his abilities, pretty much his entire backstory. We're also going to cover his villains, how they would be different, because I really think Batman's Rogues Gallery, which him and Spider-Man, in my opinion, have the two most famous ones, I think it would be vastly different than what we see today. So thanks again, guys. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you next time.